Hi, I've got my Navajo Wars game set up here, and I just wanted to show you a little bit about it, give you, I guess, a little bit of a different take on the game. There's some really good videos online already that give you a bit of a feel for what the game involves. Some walkthroughs by Joel Toppen, the creator, and particularly the video by Marco Nado, the review that got me interested in the game. The tricky thing about showing you the game is that there's quite a lot of detailed rules and what people are calling procedures, which is a good word for it, which you have to run for the game to work. So I can't really show you a lot of that. What I wanted to do was step you through some of the main game elements. And as Marco said in his review, the thing that sticks in my mind is I showed you everything and I showed you nothing. There's a lot of detail that in some ways doesn't tell you much about the game and what it's like to play, so that's what I'd like to show you, is what the game is actually like to play. First of all though, I just wanted to quickly talk over why I think this game could be interesting for people that maybe haven't considered it before. First of all though, keep in mind that this is a solo game. There is an option to play it with another player, but really this is a game you want to get because you want to play it solo. I like other solo games like Friday, Honorum and Urbion, those two card games. I quite enjoy those. This is a much more involved game than that. Another solo game I have that's quite involved in terms of rules, lots to learn, is Mage Knight, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute too, and how this game, why this game is getting more playtime for me than Mage Knight did. So yeah, it is a solo game. I want to give you a slightly different step through of it than what's been there before, and maybe give you something to think about in terms of having a look at the game if you haven't before. My preferences for gaming, generally I don't play a lot of what would be termed involved or complex games. This one's really got my attention a bit more because once you learn the procedures, it's got some fairly straightforward decisions to be made. I quite like games that throw a lot of stuff at you, particularly things that have an element of almost chaos or randomness involved, where unusual things happen. Sometimes the game gets more difficult suddenly, things don't go your way, balancing risk. I'm very interested in games like that, and I like to play games quite intuitively, so I don't really like economic games where you have to really weigh up a lot of numbers, you know, profit and loss, risk versus reward in terms of a numerical value. I prefer to look at it kind of instinctively, and like I said, intuitive approaches appeal to me much more, and this game, I believe, has got it in spades. This is not an economic game, nor is it actually a war game, as I understand it anyway. Even though it is called Navajo Wars, a lot of what you're doing in this game involves managing resources and essentially surviving as things come at you. So I guess in a way it's got more in common perhaps with some of those State of Siege games that Victory Point Games put out. I haven't actually played any of those games, and I gather this really is quite a different experience again, but it's very much that thing of things being thrown at you and trying to make decisions that will make decisions to survive, basically. So yeah, like I said, this isn't a war game as I understand it, but I'm not really a war gamer myself. I've played things like Battle Lore, very lightweight, quite like that. I've also had a go at more complex war games where you line up soldiers or armies, two army factions for instance, and have to maneuver on a map, those map-based games. I don't really know what to do in some of those games, and I've never really gotten into them. This, although it has a map, is kind of a bit more abstracted and isn't really like that kind of war game at all. Okay, just a quick overall picture of the board before we go into the details of how it's used in the game. The central part of the board is a map, 7 territories represented by coloured stones with a track to show the position of your families. So the bottom of the board actually shows you the composition of your families, different counters to show men, women and children, horses to help with movement, etc. The left-hand side of the track over here is where you track various attributes for both yourself as the Navajo and your enemy, which is the various population groups that come into the territory, the Spanish initially, the Mexicans, and then the Americans. So this track over here keeps score in terms of available action points and some other values that are used for scoring later in the game. Coming to the right hand side of the board over here, you'll see this is an area that controls the various enemy forces that challenge the Navajo, and they are controlled by a set of chits down the bottom here. You'll see them just there. And also by these cubes, which represent some actions in the game. We'll go into that in a little more detail soon. Right down the bottom here you'll see some cards I'm holding. This is a middle of a game here. I'm about a third of the way through a scenario, and these are our cultural development cards, okay, which show some special abilities customized to this particular playthrough. You buy these cards from an available selection, and also I'm holding one ceremony card, which I'll explain later, which gives me some extra ability for part of the game as well. Not without some risk, however, and that's the crux of the game, which is balancing certain risks with what is actually needed for you as the Navajo to survive the whole course of the game. So let's look at some specific areas. So if we just take up the camera and bring it down a bit closer to the map here, and you can see here the different territories. This is Shiprock, represented by the turquoise coloured stones. Down here you've got the Zuni Mountains, represented by the green stones. If we come right in close, you'll see that, for instance, in Shiprock, the areas have numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So when your family, which is represented by this counter, moves around the territory, they have to spend movement points. They have normally 6, sometimes more, sometimes less movement points, and so the cost of moving is represented by the number of the territory. So for me to move from area 4 to 5 would cost me 5 movement points, the value of the area I'm moving in. One of the interesting things though, if you see the number in brackets next to the 5 is a 3, because I have horses, this family has horses, I can use the lower value in the bracket. So that's essentially why, or you want to collect horses, and how movement works around each territory. Why do you want to move around a territory? Well, Shiprock's interesting because Shiprock is the closest territory, if we go this way, to Santa Fe. And actually I'll just put my population counter back where it was, because otherwise I'm in mid-game, so I don't want to mix that up. But if the population counter comes this way, the family counter I should say, comes this way, it becomes closer to Santa Fe. Santa Fe is where you can raid. Okay, and raiding gives you access to resources, which are tracked down here, and also controls these cubes here, has an impact on the cubes that are up here. And raiding is one of the important mechanics in the game. You raid and you will be raided yourself. So when a raid comes, it comes from Santa Fe. When it comes from the enemy, it comes from Santa Fe and comes up this track and then starts to follow the various tracks around. So when you want to avoid a raid, you may move further back up the tracks. Okay, and there's various things you can do which are probably better explained once we look at some of the other parts of the board first. The other things to note in this part of the board are these tokens here. These represent drought, so this has got one drought marker. This has an impact on the ability of the territory to feed your population, and at certain times that's very important. The other things to note are these boxes, escape and court. They tie into when you are raided. If you can manage to avoid the raid, you might end up in the escape box. If you don't, you might end up in the court box. And this has an impact on particularly the morale of the enemy. So morale is a really important factor in the game, and that's tracked right over the side of the board here. So if we scan across, see our other territories as we go across the board, and we'll come over and have a look at the real important part of the board, which is this tracking here. This is really what shows you how to succeed in the game. Okay, because you're keeping track of certain elements. If we come in and close up, the really important elements to keep track of are these ones here. At the moment they're on both at level 5, and there is military and there is morale. And at key points in the game, driven by the deck of cards that I'll show you in a minute, you will be asked to check these values. And essentially you want low morale, you want morale to go down, and you want your military, so this is your military, to go up. The morale of the enemy to go down. So these two values are extremely important. The other value that's tracked further up here, and I'm doing alright at the moment, is culture. This represents the culture of the Navajo. So as culture goes up, particularly when you're raiding missions, which we'll show you later, the culture will go up. And as culture goes up, you can actually also trade off culture and morale. So lose culture, spend culture to improve your military. It's too many M words. Okay, so I'll say that again. You can trade off culture and military. So spend culture and drive up your military. Remember, military up, morale down. Other things are tracked on here as well. For instance, I've got some unspent movement points here that probably should be off the board. So that's when you want to track how many movement points you've got available. This one is your action points, which is a different value again, and you can track them here as well. These are both Navajo values. The other enemy value you track is ferocity, and also you keep track of available enemy action points when it is their turn. This determines how much the enemy can do on their turn. I said before about the scoring, and the scoring is driven by this play deck. Okay, basically you construct this deck, and probably the best way to look at what's in the deck is to come back over here. You construct the deck, and these have already been played, these cards, so I can show you these ones as opposed to those ones which are still to come up. You basically shuffle in a combination of operation cards, which are these ones, and like I showed you before, ceremony cards, which are these ones. And in combination with those, at random, you have shuffled in predetermined scoring cards, which look like a bit like this. They're red coloured. And at the bottom, there is this victory check. And you can see that's an 8-point victory check. As the game progresses, these victory point checks get higher in value. Okay? So when you're doing an 8-point victory check, the important things to look at are the point values of each territory that you currently have a family in. So if we go to the map, Shiprock has 4, I'm also in San Juan Valley for 3, and coming over to Monument Valley is worth 2 victory points. So that gives me a total of 9, which means I have a positive value for the 8-point victory check. And because of that, my military over here would go up. At the same time as doing a victory point check based on the areas you occupy, you are also checking how many of these missions are on the board. I can just get that in focus, there we go. Missions have a positive effect on the enemy morale. So for missions on the board, or forts later in the game, morale, coming back to the track here, will go up. And ultimately what you're looking for is a positive value between military and morale. Take morale off military and you want a positive value to be moving towards a victory and a final victory in the game. So the cards drive the game. You flip a card and then you take actions. Okay, so if we just have a quick look at one of the cards. Cards have, these are the operation cards. They have an operations segment, and then they have an event, a major event, and then they have a minor event. The operations segment is the first thing to happen each time, and you have the option to go first in the operations segment by preempting. In this case you would have to spend 3 action points. And that means that when it's the enemy's turn they would only collect 2, if you can read this card, okay? If you don't preempt and the enemy goes first, they will collect 4 action points. So this is one of the key decisions you have in the game. Do I preempt or don't I? For my next turn, I'm not going to be able to preempt because I've got no action points at the moment. And the reason I've got no action points is because we just did a scoring round. And after a scoring round, your action points are reduced to 0. How do I get action points back? That requires me to pick actions or processes in the game. Some of them are actions, some of them are planning that help me to regain action points. This time the enemy will be going first, and that's not a bad thing, you know. Preempting is a good option. Sometimes it's better to let the enemy go first and then react to what the enemy does. So basically we flip a card from the deck, see what it says, and then we take our operations. Okay? So the operations segment, basically what's really handy is if you look at these summary sheets. This one summarizes the 3 operations that you can take as the Navajo. 3 different types of operation. So one is planning, another is called passage of time, and the third option is to take what's called player actions, I think. Yeah, take actions. So they're your player actions, which are summarized here. So if we look at the 3 options, player actions mostly involve things on the map and doing things with your family counters. So some player actions involve raiding. They also will involve planting corn, and they can involve, for instance, up here where there is a drought and I have a family counter in Monument Valley, this area, they can help. I can take a player action to find a new water hole which removes the drought token. But one of the key actions, and the one I want to focus on because it's the most sort of dynamic and interesting in the game, is around raiding. Okay, so as I said, I'm mid-game at the moment, but what I might do is just bring a player counter up to here and show you the raiding action. One of the types of raiding you can do is raiding Santa Fe. Okay, if I raid Santa Fe, that represents the Navajo heading off to create some mayhem, looking for resources, horses, sheep, and slaves. So when I raid, I have to spend movement points, and then basically, and here's the crux, is I come to this bag here. Okay, and in this bag, if I can just pour it out, there's a bunch of cubes. Now already some of the cubes are gone and on the board, but these are the cubes left in the bag. So you're always drawing from a selection of cubes in the bag at random. So, for instance, if I do a raid, I spend a movement point. I spend the movement cost between where I am and Santa Fe. So, I tip into the bag, boom, and I bring out a cube. Gadong. And it's a green cube. Okay, there's only one of these in the whole bag. Rather unlucky. That means that I have potentially, and I'll look over here just to show you how it works, I have stirred up the enemy, and you can look at the target here, and basically the ferocity of the enemy is going to go up, and there'll be a battle, or morale goes up and I put the cube back in the bag. So you can see already that back over here, that's a problem for us because morale goes up. It's not so good for scoring. So that was rather unlucky. The one cube that caused me a problem has come out. And it goes back in the bag. Let's draw again. And I can keep going. I can spend another movement point and grab another cube. Here we go. And this time I got a yellow cube. Okay. The yellow cube represents slaves being captured. So you can see over here again, the table over here explains all the different cubes and what they represent. In a raid, it represents slaves being captured. So I basically get to pick up a population counter from here and bring it into what's called the passage of time box, which means it's then available for me to bring into my family space at a later stage in the game. But the interesting thing about raiding, and one of the key dynamics of the game, is the raided cube goes into this collection of cubes here. Now the interesting thing here, and this is one of the key decisions you're making in the game, is that these cubes are factored into the available action points that the enemy gets on their turn. So you said, remember before I said the enemy, well let's have a look again, in this operation segment the enemy, if I didn't preempt, would get 4 action points. Okay. Let's say I had preempted, okay, because we've just taken an action, they would only get 2 action points. Now, they would get 2 action points plus the number of red cubes over here, which represent the subjugation of New Mexico. I could explain the reasoning for that, but that's just a plus. I'll just not overload it at the moment. That's a positive value to the enemy action point, so that is 4. But see over here, we've got 2, 4, 6 cubes in the raided cubes box, so that's a negative value. Okay, it's a negative value, so that's actually 2 plus 2 is 4, but a negative value of 6 is minus 2. The enemy always gets 1. They never lose action points. So actually what we're doing by keeping cubes here is denying the enemy action points. So raiding and getting cubes into the raided cubes area is very helpful to slow down the passage of enemy actions. The cubes eventually, depending on what's on the card or what actions are taken in other stages of the game, will move away from there into the recovery box and then eventually back into the bag. But having them in the raided cubes box, very good. Okay, so that's one of the key things to weigh up all the time. Can I keep the actions available to the enemy down by keeping raided cubes in here? Of course, raiding is risky because it also brings out the red cubes which come here, or the green cubes which cause a negative outcome for the Navajo. When the enemy gets action points, they then have this track here to deal with, to work through. So, enemy action points, if I can just readjust my camera slightly, come down a little bit closer here.
enemy action points are spent to activate the actions on this track. Starting from the top, starting from the active column, which is the right hand one, you'll see here there is a raid and it costs 7 action points. Okay, so coming over here, what you notice is the enemy at the moment is on 5 action points. So remember what I did before? I denied them the action points they were going to get, and they only get 1, so they would only go up to 6. Now, because this requires 7, they would not execute this action until the next turn. So essentially you've stymied their raid for another round and got some time to prepare a response. And you'll see here, you can see what's coming in the queue. Okay, but the key factor to keep in mind is that after action points are allocated, but before they're actually taken, you roll the dice. Now, I just rolled and got a 3 and a 4. That would mean that the number 3 action and the number 4 action are actually flipped over to reveal a different action. Okay, so this is how the enemy keeps you on your toes. Okay, so sorry it's gone a bit out of focus here, we'll just adjust again. I might got it on a tripod still, which probably isn't a good idea. There we go, that's better. Now if we look here, if we flip number 3, we go from having a raid by the Utes to a colonize action. So quite a different action that would be taken by the enemy. The other thing to keep in mind is the red ones, once they're over on their raid side, they never flip. They start on this side here. It's a subjugate action, but once they're over, they never flip. However, one of the other things that can happen is if you roll the same number, a 2 and a 2 for instance, there we go, the standby action swaps with the active action, so these two would swap around. So that happens before the action points are allocated, and it can actually change quite dramatically what's going to happen on the enemy's turn. You've been planning for a raid, and then suddenly, for instance, you might end up with an action that costs less, and it's happening, and you haven't really responded as well as you could because it's something you weren't expecting. If there was a raid, it'd be interesting to look at how that works. Okay, so raids are a key part of the game and really take a little bit of getting used to. Okay, coming back here, if there was, let's say a 7-point raid was triggered, what would happen is 7 counters would become available to the enemy. This is just a rough run through here. 7 raid counters plus the total ferocity of all your families on the board. Now ferocity is this red number here. Ferocity goes up and down. When you do raids, your ferocity goes up. You can reduce your ferocity back down, and that can be a good thing to do because you may want to avoid the raids when they come, and low ferocity helps you avoid the raids. But also ferocity, positive ferocity, so the red value being positive, as opposed to, you can look at this counter here, the same family can end up with 0 ferocity. Okay, but when ferocity is a positive value, it increases the strength of a raid. Okay, so at the moment we've got 2 ferocity and 1 ferocity up here, so that's and 0 over here, 3 families on the board. So 3 ferocity adds another 3 raid tokens to the board. So you can see the game kind of responds to your state. Okay, so this would put a total of 10 raid counters on the board. The raid counters begin from Santa Fe and then off they go. Boom, boom. Now we have a junction. They head to the closest family. Okay, from here. So they would actually come around to here. In preparation for a raid, if it was going to happen, I would probably have put this family much further back. By putting a family much further back, you keep them away from the raiding party and you direct the raid to a different family. Let's just say, to prepare for the raid, I pushed them right back and I pushed my other token further back as well. Okay? So then the raid, in fact, let's push them right back to there. So at this junction, you basically decide which is closer. At the moment, this one is closer. So the raid would go this way. And off it goes. And the cubes start to fill, the tokens fill up the space. When the raid encounters a family, there's a couple of options. What I've done here is set this up for an ambush. A family with high ferocity at a high value area will probably be trying to do an ambush. Another option to respond to the raid, and an ambush can end up with a positive outcome for the Navajo and reduced morale for the enemy, which is a good thing. Another option you've got when a raid comes through is to reduce your ferocity down, and let's say I could get my ferocity to 0, and you can do that through a different type of operation called planning, and we'll show you that in a minute. If you reduce your morale, ferocity down, then what happens is your evasion modifier, which is the black number, goes up, and in this case the evasion modifier is +2. That then helps you to do one of two things. One is to avoid the raid or evade the raid, and that means you basically run away, move further up the track. This other thing that you can do is negotiate. Okay? And negotiate means that you not just move up the track, but you fully escape the raid, which means you come to here. Negotiation is based on a die roll with some modifiers. You collect these things called trade goods down here. You can throw them into your die roll, and if you roll greater than 5, so your evasion modifier plus trade goods plus your die roll is greater than 5, so let's say I rolled 3 and 2 and threw in a trade good would be 6, then the negotiation is successful and you go to the escape box. Now, basically at that point, you've gone and the raid goes elsewhere and hopefully starts to run out of steam. So it heads up this track here and has to decide where to go. The other thing you can do is harass, spend an action point, and harass means that 2 counters have to go on the square instead of 1. And so eventually what you're trying to do is completely, let's say I managed to evade the raid here and come all the way back to number 6, then the raid is done. There's no more cubes here, no more counters here. And because there were no families caught, which is the negative outcome of the raid, then morale goes down. So remember, morale in the victory point check, which is way over here, is reduced. So that is a good thing. So raids become this dynamic where you're trying to basically drive the enemy's morale down by the raids being unsuccessful, and you have those different options for how to react to the raids. And they really need planning. So you try to set yourself up a turn beforehand to respond effectively. So that's the raiding, and it's one of the more interesting mechanics in the game, and really one of the ways that you set yourself up for victory. What I didn't show you was that once you run an action, so let's say the raid had been done, it just moves to the side like that, and let's say I had enough to run this action as well, enough action points, that moves to the side too, and then they simply go down the queue to the back, and see it, obviously it's quite clever because it's reversed the order of those 2 cubes, and then we push these up. So these cubes go up the queue. And remember, at various times you can be switching what's called the standby column over as well. So it's quite a dynamic system that's really, really easy to run, and it delivers you something quite unique each time. Looking at what's coming up in the queue is real key, and the active queue is key to your planning. But with a die roll they can flip and suddenly it's all changed. It's a very enjoyable part of the game, if sometimes quite painful. The other things you can do instead of these player actions, the other things available on your turn are planning. Now planning really brings you into this area here of the board, which is the elder display. So below the map you've got these tokens here called elders, and the cool thing here is that these elders gradually age, so they move from this side to this side, and you can see the modifiers get better and better. The die roll numbers underneath here, you see. So this one's 1 to 3, 1 to 4, 1 to 5. To trigger these elder actions you must roll within this range, so the older your elders are, the more chance you've got of succeeding in what's called the planning stage. Now the planning stage is really important, firstly for these elder actions, which let you reduce ferocity, so that would let you take this 2 ferocity family and reduce it down, using this one here, to 1, and that means you're more likely to be able to negotiate and evade raids. It can also let you increase ferocity if you're after a battle instead, but like I said, this isn't really a war game, so you often are not battling. Battling is probably something you say for real particular circumstances. More often you probably are going to be trying to reduce your ferocity and evade or negotiate. So elder actions can let you do that by having a successful elder action. Rolling, you get a die roll for each elder. If it's successful you can reduce your ferocity, change your ferocity. You can also move culture points down and military points up, which again, higher military helps you when you're scoring. The other thing you can do with your elder actions is to add action points. The other important thing about planning is that planning will give you more population. So when you do a planning phase, you'll be bringing population onto the board, which can help you to start another family. You need more families because you want to occupy more territories on the board to help with these growing victory point checks. And also planning will help you to acquire trade goods, which become helpful to change die rolls and reverse outcomes that aren't so good for you. And planning also gives you a basic stock of action points for every elder you've got. So the planning operation is really key for action points and for increasing your action points. The currency of action points is really important to the game, because when you look at these operation cards, if I come back and just show you this one for instance, so this one lets you preempt, go first for 2 APs, action points, and restrict the enemy to just 2 action points rather than 3. And it's variable each time, so if you look at this card when it comes up, there's different combinations of action points here. Preempt for 3, restrict the enemy to 4 instead of 5 action points. So you never quite know what amount of action points are going to become available, and deciding when to plan is really important, because sometimes you think something's coming and I really need to get ready for that, and you might want to do the board-based actions and start moving your pieces around, okay, to get ready for maybe a raid or something that's coming. But maybe you'd be better to plan and get these action points up so that you're in a better position to react to what comes. So that's one of the decisions you have to start weighing up. The other thing about planning, which is interesting, is it's got a lot of positive impacts in terms of increasing your action points, changing your ferocity, like I said before, and importantly moving your military up if you'd want to take that option. But what it also does, if we come over to this side of the board, is it does what's called resetting the cubes. So when you reset cubes, you push everything out of the rated cubes box to the recovery box. And of course, as I said before, that has an impact on available enemy actions. Suddenly they will have a much larger pool of action points available to them. these cubes don't get back into the bag until another reset, which moves everything from what's called the recovery box back into the bag. So you almost need to be getting them back in the bag so you can raid again. Get the raided cubes back out here and reduce the number of enemy action points. That's one of the most interesting mechanics in the game. How do I get the cubes back in here? And also, how much risk am I running of one of those bad things coming out? Because as the bag gets emptier, of course the risk of you drawing the less favourable cubes increases. So that's planning. That's one of the operations. The other operation, you've got a choice of three Navajo operations. You've got your planning, which really revolves around these elders. You've got player actions operation, which is really moving around the board, changing positions of your families, helping with droughts. You can also generate action points on a limited basis using player actions as your operation choice. The third operation choice you have is passage of time, and as you can see there's a box here called passage of time, and this is really the one I find really hardest to fit in sometimes, but it's very important because remember what I said about when these cards come out at predetermined, they come out in a set order, but you don't quite know when, these victory cards. So they're shuffled into a set of 8 random cards, and you don't know whether it's the third card of the 8 or the 8th. So you know what order they're going to come in, but not when. This one's an 8 victory point check. The second one that comes out is a 10 victory point check. Now to be positive, to have a positive result for that victory point check, you've got to have these areas occupied on the board. So remember I had 9 points from the 3 areas that I already occupy. To get myself over 10 for that second victory point check, I really need to come somewhere like the Zuni Mountains, which gives me another 3 victory points. So to do that, I need a 4th family. And that's passage of time. It's really tied up with getting these markers, these counters, which come out as part of planning and also an effect of the ceremony cards. They come from the out of play box for the player, which is here. These are resources that you don't yet have access to. And then they come over here to the passage of time box. When you actually do a passage of time, you can then take the resources and convert some of them to elders, and some of them come down here into a new family box. So this would be family D, the 4th family. And then you could bring this family counter onto the board, okay? Bring it onto the board to represent that family coming into play. You've got 2 counters because that's just a way to change the ferocity and evasion numbers, the black and the red number. But you basically bring one of these counters onto the board, and you can bring them into Canyon de Chelly, which is the home area, and then you move them out. And moving them out and getting them into these areas where you get victory points is very important. So passage of time brings these counters, and really I've only got 2 at the moment. I really need 3 or 4 in here to make it worth doing passage of time. The same thing, the other cool thing that happens with passage of time is that your elders get older as you plan. They move up the track. Every planning stage moves them along the track until they get right to the end. Then you've got to do a death check. So for instance, the elder right at the end here, you roll a dice for that elder, and if you roll 1 to 5, the elder dies. So you have to roll a 6 to keep that elder alive, otherwise it's gone. Same here, you've got to roll a 5 or a 6 to keep this one alive, and so on. So the younger elders are easier to keep alive. So you lose them, so what you are wanting to do is bring some new elders on to help with your planning. And they also help with how many families you can activate in your actions phase as well. And the problem with passage of time too is if you bring families on and you don't fill it, say I only brought these 2 on, maybe I turned this child into an adult and brought an adult and a woman on here, but the child space was free, then you start to lose culture points for not having a fully rounded family group. So that's not so good either. The other thing that happens with passage of time is feeding. So you come over to these resources, which might be corn. Now corn is planted as part of your one of your player actions, and also harvested, and it's random, so they have variable values. You can see this one's got 3, this one's got 0. You don't really know what you're getting till you flip them over at harvest time. And I've got a sheep, and I've got a spare horse as well. I obviously, with some raiding, got an extra set of horses there. The sheep will multiply during passage of time to create another sheep, and then that sheep will feed 4 family members. The corn will feed a total of 3 family members there. That includes your elders as well, so if you've got 3 complete family groups, there's 9 plus 3 elders, might be 12 that you've got to feed. What also feeds your family is the arability of your area that you're in. So if you come over here, this area it's got 1 drought counter, which means it only feeds 2 families. So it simply generates a value of 2 for feeding. So you do get some feeding off your just off occupying an area. Down here, this would only generate 1 point towards feeding because it's got 2 drought counters. So that's passage of time. I'm really brushing over some of the rules here, not the finer details. So you've got the general idea there of the 3 different things you're trying to do in your operations phase. So when you come back to the card, the operations segment, the enemy is doing its actions, and you're choosing one of those 3 operations. And then, when that is done, you come down to these major events. Okay, the major events can be positive or negative state changes, I would call them, for the whole board. So this one, remove all corn counters from territories with at least 1 drought counter. So that's called bad harvest. A more positive one would be this one, which is also about getting corn without having, just straight into your resources box without having to plant it. Okay, so that's only if you've done a planning operation. So some of them are conditional, these major events. Another positive major event is one of the very popular ones when it comes up as the shaman event. We'll just let the camera get that. There you go. If the planning operation is executed, you can look at the next 3 cards and rearrange them in any order. That is so valuable, and you will always, nearly always, want to do a planning that round to get that event. More negative events, things like hostile tribes, will make it more likely that the Utes and the Comanche will come and raid you. And this one here, Pueblo War in the West, affects the 2 bottom territories, the Zuni Mountains and the Hopi land. And if you've got family members in here or in here, when this hits, that can be quite bad. You'll lose some of your family tokens. And a reason to possibly stay out of these areas until you really need them for the victory point checks later in the game. So these major events come around, and there's more than one of each of these in the deck. So you kind of get to know you get familiar with what could be coming, but you never quite know. Okay, and then after the major event, you do a minor event, which is kind of a housekeeping function. This one is roll a dice, and that number tells you which 2 instructions are going to just swap places on the action track. So that's the enemy action track. So if I rolled a 4, I'd come over here and I'd look at raid and subvert. They would flip around. If I rolled a 1, then the next action would change over, which can really be a state changer. The other sort of housekeeping ones are and minor events. This one, and territory recovers from a drought. Equally, you can have a minor event that adds a drought token. And one of the real spanners in the works can be this one here, which is a cube reset as a minor event. So if I'd already done planning and moved the cubes to here, to the recovery box, when I get to the minor event, if it was this card, they would then go straight back into the bag, which is really nicely set up for a bit more, probably a bit more raiding. Yeah. So that's the operation cards in a whole overview, and they really drive the game. Like I said, you shuffle these up with these other ceremony cards that I'll explain in a minute in sets of 8. You put them with one of the red scoring cards, and they go into a set order in the deck. So you know that the scoring cards are going to come out in a set order, but you're not exactly sure when. And then these ceremony cards, just to quickly call those, are a really interesting part of the game. If you keep them, they will let you, they don't do any particular action apart from resetting cubes and giving you a population counter if you decide to keep them. If you decide to keep the ceremony card, you'll also get the ability to have this die roll on your operations segment, which is really handy. But the bad side is if you draw another ceremony card while you have one or more of these ceremony cards in your hand, if another one comes out of the play deck, it brings what's called the enemy way, which is a bad effect. And depending on the value of the dice, like the 6 is a particularly nasty negative effect on your game. Some of the lower dice values are not so. This one just adds 2 intruder counters. So these are these surprise counters that come on the board. Many of them are unhelpful. Some of them are more positive. Just turn that the right way around. And when you move on it, you flip it. So it can start to impede your movement around the board, and you have to start to deal with these intruders. And of course, the other thing that's coming on the board as a result of particularly this action called build are these missions, like I said before. So they'll start on number 1. If you get another build, so it'll start with the territory 1, which is Shiprock, and an area 1. And then if another build comes out, it'll go on territory 1 of area 2, which is San Juan Valley. And then you can get this action called expand. And if you haven't knocked these missions off by raiding them, they will move forwards, okay? When they move forwards, 1, they deteriorate your culture points, and 2, they just become that much harder to knock off because you must have a 6. When you raid them, you must have 1 hit to move them back to area 1, and then 2 hits to remove them completely, okay? So the missions are really, really disruptive to the game, to your survival, and you really need to deal with them. The other thing we haven't really touched on is just these cultural development cards. Like I said, you start with 1. There's a choice of a few different types of cultural development. 3 of them are removed from the game, and then you get to choose from these others, and they have a level 1, 2, and 3. I chose Cunning as my starting culture. Actually, no, I didn't. I chose Wisdom of the Ancient Ones as my starting culture. You get to choose one of these cards. This lets me convert 1, during planning, to convert 1 culture point to 1 military point without having to have a successful elder action die roll. So I can basically just do it. The action automatically succeeds. That's really handy early on to get your military up. And the other one, which is a lot of people like, is this Cunning one, which I got after the first victory point check. So after each victory point check, you can actually buy another cultural development. This one lets you bypass 1 enemy action. If it's going to be particularly devastating for you, you can just say, nope, I don't want that one to happen. Push it to the side and go to the next one. You don't want to do that too often, because sometimes, like for instance a raid, it's better to let those action points, if it's a big raid, get chewed up, 7, 8, 9 action points gone, than to let those 7, 8, 9 action points be expended over the next 2 or 3 tokens. So if you look over here, if I let that 7 go, and 7 action points have been accumulated, the next 2 actions would come into play, which may be even worse than just having that raid. Raids are something to hopefully anticipate, get ready for, and manage and turn to your advantage. And that's really the key of this game. Turn some of these bad things to your advantage. Understand how the mechanisms work. It's really key decision points when you're looking at things like raids coming up, or you're looking at needing to bring a passage of time through. When do I do it? What's the most important thing to be doing right now? And whenever these missions come on the board, really got to weigh up carefully when are you going to raid these. As soon as possible is normally the best answer. So it can be very difficult if you've got that shaman action, for instance, that is benefiting you if you plan. If you plan, you can look at 3 cards. That's great. But look, these missions are there, and you know they're moving forwards, and the further they move, the harder they are to get rid of. And every time they move, they hurt my culture. And if there's another build and another mission comes on, when they move again, that's 3 culture points instead of 2 that I'm losing. You're really weighing up, what do I really have to do right now? That's what I like about the game, because it is, in the end, a game of kind of restrained, limited choices. Not unlimited, Mage Knight is this kind of myriad of options. This has a lot going on, but the choices become quite crystallized into 1 or 2 things. Which is the most important thing to do right now? And ultimately, of course, what you are trying to do is just expand the number of families. So you really want a fourth family in time for the later victory checks, and even a fifth family. You can play the game to different lengths, so I would really recommend your first few games just play the very shortest scenario and get used to some of the mechanics. Every time I've played this game, something different has happened, you know, a different sequence of operations cards or ceremony cards, and you're in a different kind of problem. You know those scoring things are coming, but you don't quite know when, and at the same time you've got these different problems to deal with. This time I'm having a lot of difficulty getting passage of time because I had scoring rounds which kind of removed my at the end of the scoring round you do lose population counters, so I've had a lot of trouble getting my passage of time ready, but at the same time I'm really quite happy that my morale and military are still quite in balance. I was actually quite ahead for a while there, and then had a bit of a knockback with 2 missions being on the board when scoring came, and that kind of made things a little bit trickier because those missions boost the morale. Yeah, I'm quite happy with how this is going, but my biggest problem at the moment is expanding my population, and also this raid that's coming. I'm hoping to turn it to my advantage and get the morale of the enemy down by avoiding these raids and not giving them the satisfaction of any victory with the raid that's coming. So that's my next stage. Very interesting stage in the game for me right now. Just looking at these enemy action tokens, the other thing to keep in mind is it's a random mix each time, in that 2 of the counters are drawn out at random and not used, so the exact sequence is always a little bit unpredictable. The tokens are leaded, as you can see here. Yeah, just let that camera pick those up. Yeah, there we go. So they come initially at the start of the game in alphabet order, and they kind of stay that way, but they can start to get jumbled as tokens swap places. And remember also that some of them just are removed, 2 are just taken out at the start. So there's a kind of an order to how they come, but it becomes more and more scrambled as the game goes on. And yeah, you know, things like building brings the missions on. The Comanche and the Utes are tribal raids that just kind of pester you a little bit. Colonize can do a variety of things, but it can at least affect the cubes that are in the raided cubes box. So back up here it can move cubes around. Build and subvert is pretty painful. That's really about doing both building and making sure that this thing called subjugation of New Mexico, which increases increases the enemy available action points as it's completed, and really is a major turning point in the early part of the game. So subvert helps with the progression towards that, helps the enemy get on there. And then the other really worrying one, which we can't see here, but I'm just looking for it, is the one called expand, which moves. We haven't got it there at the moment, but it causes the missions to move. Something's flipped and it's gone. And as you can see, raids of various sizes, including 7 and 9, and in fact there's an 11 raid as well, quite a powerful one. So yeah, you never quite know what you're going to get, and this again has a big impact on especially the early part of the game and how it develops when you take those 2 counters out at the start. It's a very interesting system for controlling the sort of AI of the game, and I think it's one of the really strong parts of the design, because it is very simple to run and to understand what each of them does. Once you know what you've sort of run the game a couple of times, you simply are using this really handy reference chart here, which basically tells you what each of these enemy actions does in a nutshell, and it does become very, very easy to run. Yeah, see, it's just described there very, very simply. Running the AI is probably the easiest part of the game, and makes you really concentrate on, well, what do I do in response? Your head isn't in two spaces at once. The enemy sort of runs itself. So that's a little bit about the game and why I got into it. Just also want to talk briefly about the simulation aspect of the game. This game represents the struggles of the Navajo people for a period, as it says here, 1598 to 1864. So as an experience, this game really does throw you into what was a real situation for a group of people. And I have really been captivated by that. As a New Zealander, I didn't know much about the situation. Well, I understood the situation for Native American peoples, but not much of the actual history. So this was really interesting to get into. And I'll just make a quick mention that I did do what probably lots of people have done and picked up Blood and Thunder by Hampton Sides, and I'm making my way through it at the moment. Just about finished it. I don't actually have this book sitting by the game board and read it as I play, but I've been reading it as I've gotten into the game over the last couple of months, and I've thoroughly enjoyed the book and really recommend it. And it does really bring the game to life, and I think as an experience this game has some really unique things going for it.